This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, from Philadelphia to Erie and from Pittsburgh to Scranton, it's Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenawalt, Senior Fellow of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy, and for this show I'm joined by Jere Strittmatter, who is a board member of Susquehanna Valley Center and a former state legislator from Lancaster County. Jere, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much for giving me this honor to be with you and to learn so much.
Well, it's always good to bring your expertise here and help us delve into some of these issues. Today we have a new guest, someone we've not had before, but someone who you know, Jere, Mr. Curt Schroder, who's the executive director of the Pennsylvania Coalition of Civil Justice Reform. Welcome to the show, Curt.
Well, thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Jere.
Yes.
It's good to see you again.
Yes, great.
I guess what we'd like to do, since you're new to the show, we'd like to start out if you could tell us a little bit about your organization, what it is, what it hopes to do, and a little bit about your background. Where do you come from, and how do you fit into that organization, Curt?
Okay, sure. Well, I guess my main claim to fame is I was a colleague of Jere Strittmatter's for many years in the state legislature. I represented a portion of Chester County for 17 years in the state house. And during that time, I had the opportunity to work on a number of what we refer to as civil litigation issues. In other words, issues that tend to limit abusive lawsuits, frivolous lawsuits, and put some guardrails basically on what the trial bar can do, and doesn't allow them to take advantage of the productive sector such as business and healthcare, from which they are always trying to reap ample riches and rewards. So I became, enmeshed in those type of issues back then, whether it was the medical liability crisis back in the early 2000s, whether it was working on a bill that became what's known as the Fair Share Act in the General Assembly. And I do want to talk about that because that is at issue, right now on some of the things that we are working on. So about 6 years ago, the Pennsylvania Coalition for Civil Justice Reform came into being, and it was established to provide a single yet continuous voice for litigation fairness in our Commonwealth. For far too long, the organization that represents the plaintiffs' attorneys in this state had their permanent presence, in the halls of the General Assembly.
The Pennsylvania Trial Lawyers, among other organizations.
Pennsylvania Trial Lawyers, they're now called the Association for Justice. I won't comment any more on that, but yes, that organization. So we, came on the scene to basically make sure that defendants, those who are the victims of lawsuits, have a voice, and that their interests are not totally steamrolled by the so-called personal injury attorneys, the trial bar in the Commonwealth. And we're composed of a broad-based, nonpartisan coalition of businesses, both large and small, healthcare entities, organizations that represent business and healthcare and other professions, nonprofit organizations, taxpayers. So we have a very broad base all across this Commonwealth now that has come together to fight for fairness in litigation and fight lawsuit abuse.
Fairness is always important, and appreciate your organization, trying to bring fairness, because there's always people are trying to, beat the system.
Yes.
Try to find a way to get around certain things. Judge shopping,
right.
Jurisdiction shopping. Taking cases. I remember in Armstrong World Industries taking cases down to Texas.
Sure.
Because they found a place and some precedents there.
Right.
So how big are you, or like with your group, in order to keep a handle on that? It just seems to be so tough, but it's good you're doing it. How many people do you have working with you?
Well, we're the lone organization in the state that is devoted exclusively to that type of thing. Now, many industries and many organizations have components of that, within the work that they do. But we're the only one that devotes ourselves exclusively to watching out and being a watchdog for the civil litigation system.
How many people do you have?
Here in the Commonwealth. Well, it's me. I have an assistant, but we have a broad-based board of directors who also chip in and do a lot of work. We have a 15-member board. We have about 30 additional members in addition to our board of directors. And like I said, they come in all shapes and sizes. There are big companies that do business in Pennsylvania. There are small businesses. There are doctors' organizations, hospitals, and hospital organizations that represent them. So, accountants is one of the other professions, that are in our coalition. So I think we're about as broad-based as you can get. And basically, we have a footprint now all across the Commonwealth with our geographic representation. And that's something that wasn't there before. That's something that, business and healthcare and those who are victims of lawsuits did not have in their corner.
And with all the different levels of judiciary, too, is another complicating factor.
Well, there is. We have an appellate court system here in Pennsylvania that we get very involved in. One of the important jobs that we do is we file what are called amicus briefs, or friends of the court briefs. For those cases that are going up through the appellate system and will eventually reach the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And so, unlike in the past, when they would only hear from the personal injury attorneys in their amicus briefs, we now, are having our voice amplified inside the appellate courts, inside the Supreme Court, and making sure that the courts know and understand from our perspective what the impact of their decisions will be, both legally and public policy-wise. So I think that's a very important service that we provide. And you mentioned the courts. We have a very activist Supreme Court, Pennsylvania Supreme Court at the moment. There are longstanding precedents, both in case law as well as in statute, that provide guardrails and protection during litigation, for those being sued, that have either been eroded or are in danger of being eroded by decisions, going up through the court. Just a case in point, I mentioned the Fair Share Act as something I worked on as a legislator. That act, dealt with what we call the deep pocket theory of litigation. There are companies that are sometimes sued just because they have a deep pocket and the plaintiff's attorney believes that they'll be able to pay the entire judgment. Well, that was happening so much that it created a lot of unfairness in the system. It used to be under the old law, before we changed it back in 2011, that if you were only a few percentage points at fault, in other words, if you were assigned a fault at 30% by the jury, you could still be required to pay 100% of that verdict or judgment. If the other defendants were unable to meet their share or their burden. Once the Fair Share Act was passed, though, that's completely changed. Now, if you're 30% at fault, as determined by the jury or the judge, you only pay 30% of whatever they award. So it really, inserts that element of fairness into the system that was completely missing. Well,
and that was a major change.
It was a major litigation reform. It was perhaps the last systemic litigation reform that we had in the Commonwealth. And then we had a Governor Corbett, who was willing to sign it, most importantly. So that change has worked very well. But there have been cases now that have gone up through the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that have started to erode the protections under the Fair Share Act. They've determined that the Fair Share Act does not apply to asbestos strict liability cases, in spite of the fact that there's plain language in the Fair Share Act that says this applies to strict liability cases. We have that type of thing happening that's eroding it. One Superior Court decision has said the Fair Share Act only applies if the plaintiff, his or herself, is also negligent. Well, that was never intended to be the case, okay?
Where did that come from?
You've got me. They went through a lot of legal gymnastics and a lot of analysis of case law history that had nothing to do with the statute itself in order to justify this opinion or this conclusion. So our organization, the Pennsylvania Coalition for Civil Justice Reform, we're working on legislation to remedy that and to restore the original legislative intent of the Fair Share Act.
Well, for our viewers across the state, many of these things are over our heads, and if they want to get more information, I know we'll get from you, your website that they can get in touch with you. But are there other ways across the state or to you to communicate with you? To say, hey, I'd like to learn more.
Sure.
Or I'd like to be, start participating with you.
Sure, I'd love to hear from people out there. And my email, it's very simple. It's Curt with a C, C-U-R-T at pccjr.org.
Okay, great.
And we have a very informative website up as well.
This sounds very much like, the Trial Lawyers Association lost their fight over the Fair Share Act, and now they're going to go back and are slowly going to dismantle it piece by piece by piece. Is that essentially what's going on here?
You've hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what they're doing. They're trying to erode various protections, such as the Fair Share Act, piece by piece by piece. Not all in one fell swoop, but they're trying to get enough court decisions that weaken it so that it is much less effective. And there's another example of what they're doing right now as well, and that is the issue of medical liability venue. Now, venue, once again, that's a legal term, but all it means is where you can bring a case in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
That location.
Yeah, what county can you bring a case in? Prior to 2003, doctors and hospitals from all across Pennsylvania were being dragged into the Philadelphia court system, regardless of whether any medical injury or medical liability incident had any connection with the city of Philadelphia. And there was one reason, and one reason only, that was happening, because Philadelphia is the home of nuclear verdicts. It has been declared a judicial hellhole by the American Tort Reform Association. And it is well known that if you get sued in Philadelphia, you might as well just settle, because instead of risk going to trial and being perhaps put out of business. So they brought as many cases as they could find some remote legal justification to bring them in the city of Philadelphia. That was not the only contributor, but a major contributor to the medical liability crisis of the early 2000s. Well, we worked very hard in the legislature, and we also worked with the courts at that time to correct that. The Supreme Court adopted a venue rule, which now, under the rule they adopted, you can only bring a case where the cause of action arose. In other words, where the alleged injury in a medical liability case actually occurred, whatever county that was. That was a great reform. It reduced drastically the number of cases brought in Philadelphia. Cases were now being brought in the counties where it was actually proper to bring it. The trial bar has always, the plaintiff's lawyers have always hated that rule. And so what they've done is they have managed to get a committee of the Supreme Court to introduce a rule proposal to totally reverse that. In other words, take us back to the pre-2003 rule change that I just described, when forum shopping, venue shopping was rampant, okay? So if that rule goes through, physicians, hospitals, health systems, nurses, you name it, if they are sued, they face, being brought in from central Pennsylvania, from Reading, from Lancaster, into the city of Philadelphia, because a lot of those hospitals are now owned by city-based health systems, okay? So that...
Well, we're going to have you back.
That
for sure,
compounds the
because
problem.
this is getting so complicated that, for our viewers to understand, we have to have you
I
back
would love to
soon.
come back and explain that
Yeah.
more. So we need a constitutional amendment so that the legislature can correct whatever damage the court decides to
But
do
we have to have
on
you
this.
back right
Okay,
away.
thank you very much, Curt.
My pleasure.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. We're going to have you back soon.
My pleasure.
We'll be back in the next segment right away.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors, the largest, most influential municipal association in the Commonwealth. Since 1921, PSATS has been preserving and strengthening township government and securing greater visibility and involvement for townships in the state and federal political arenas. Covering 95% of Pennsylvania's land mass, townships represent 5.5 million residents, more than any other type of political subdivision in Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Visit pahighwayinfo.org.
Hi, welcome back. On this segment of Behind the Headlines, Jerry and I are fortunate enough to have a very important guest join us who's bringing us up to date on state transportation, and that's Bob Latham, who's the Executive Vice President of the Pennsylvania State Associated Constructors. So,
That's correct.
It's nice to have you back because it's hard for the general public to stay up with what's happening now in transportation, particularly with the increase in gas prices around the nation. And I wanted to start you off before Jerry takes charge on what's going on with this idea, Bob, in Pennsylvania and around the country of having a gas tax holiday, reducing the price of gasoline tax or eliminating it.
Well, Charlie and Jerry, it's good to be back with you two as always. And you're right, we represent the 30,000 people around the state of Pennsylvania that build our roads and bridges, companies, 150 private construction companies that do the work and employ many thousands of people fixing our roads and bridges around the Commonwealth. The primary source of funding for highway construction, bridge repair, is through the gas tax. It was last raised, if you will, in 2013, and that was an incremental increase that capped off at in 2016. So we've seen no movement, no increase in the price of in the tax on gasoline for quite some time. And you're right, the price of fuel has gone precipitously up over the last year or so. Due to global forces, mostly market forces to begin with, and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So our tax has very little to do with major fluctuations in the price of fuel. Unfortunately, political hyperbole has made it popular among some people seeking office to suggest that we should, as a way to reduce the price of fuel at the pump, we could reduce our gas tax. And that's just simply not true. I mean, what we've seen, we've done empirical studies that show that you really get about a third of the what we call bang for the buck. So if you were to reduce the tax by 60 cents, you might see a 20-cent movement in the price in the price at the pump. So it really doesn't get you that much. So what does it do? It would take away about $1 billion a year in funding for roads and bridges, which obviously we think is a bad idea. And the other thing about, again, you hear rhetoric about our gas tax being the second highest in the country. That's true. But one of the reasons for that is we have decided to have the public policy in Pennsylvania is that we have a low registration fee. So you can register a vehicle for very little money in Pennsylvania compared to other states. And the theory is this: if I want to be able to drive a vehicle on the road, but not a lot, maybe just a few miles a week or around town, I pay a little bit amount of money to be able to do that. But if I drive thousands of miles a month, I pay more because I pay a consumption tax, a user fee for gasoline. So other states may have lower fuel taxes than we, but you pay exorbitant amounts of sales tax on vehicles. You pay personal property tax on vehicles in Virginia, and that's whether you drive the vehicle a lot or not. So we're very much opposed to this gas tax holiday business. We don't think it really is going to mean much to people at the pump. Again, you see a level gas tax in Pennsylvania for the last 5 years, and the price at the pump goes like this. So there's really no assurance that even dropping the gas tax would have an impact on fuel prices at the pump. We saw them as high as $4.60, drop down to $4.10, back up to $4.30. All that while we've done nothing with the gas tax. So we think that that's a bad idea.
And if we don't have the funds, the reason we're going to see all the cones, coming up, we hope, starting soon, is safety reasons. Everyone who's driving, Pennsylvania being the Keystone State, that if you want to get anywhere, you have to go through Pennsylvania.
Right.
We were a farming, community, so we have roads all over the place, that are unsafe, that need to be fixed. And there was that, when you're talking about that policy decision, was to have user fees, be able to take care of this.
Right.
People who register, their vehicle, or people who buy fuel. That eliminates the people who have electric cars, who aren't paying their fair share, as well as in other states, the people compared to, aren't I correct, that they even go into the general fund, which is, if you don't get it from the gas tax, and you have to go into the general fund. And then with local roads that we have more than any other state, they would have to increase all their property taxes.
You're right, and I was just about
It's
to,
crazy.
I was just about to point that out. Our local municipalities draw a significant portion of our gas tax for their purposes of maintaining their local roads. And you're right, if you drop the gas tax, they would suffer a drop in revenue. And then you're right, so your local borough or township has no alternative in order to keep its local streets together than to raise property taxes. So really, what are you doing here? And you also make a good point, Jerry, is that our gas tax captures revenue from people who are driving through the state. Now, in some instances, you could maybe get from one end of the state to the other if you had already fueled in another state. But primarily, if you're driving through Pennsylvania, you probably have to stop and contribute to our highway fund by buying gasoline in the state.
Well, they're wearing out our
So
roads,
so if we were to drop the gas tax, and then you rely on higher
Pennsylvania.
registration fees than Pennsylvania residents pay, and out-of-state residents don't. So so there's I think there's a very reasonable public policy debate and resistance to this idea of dropping the fuel tax. You hear this every once in a while when the price goes through the roof, and then it'll come back down. But the bottom line is that the tax is not a significant driver of the price of gasoline at the pump. So if you want to drop the price of gasoline at the pump, let's go back to where we were in 2019, 2020, and have a robust national energy program where we're pumping our own natural gas and pumping our own gas out of the shale gas fields and become energy independent, as opposed to buying it from foreign countries.
Well, this pandemic has resulted in so many things, but as it peters out, we find that whereas during the pandemic traffic was minimized, particularly on the turnpike, we find now that the turnpike traffic has returned. That 90% of the volume has returned, but the people are driving faster than ever. This goes back to another area that your association has worked so diligently on, and that's work zone safety. What's going on in that area, Bob?
Charlie, you make a good point there. So almost all road work now is repair work. There's very little new construction of new roads. So it's all under traffic. We're working at night, and we're simply trying to get people to slow down through work zones. We have seen, unfortunately, an increase in average speeds. One of the things that the pandemic spurred was I don't know, people feel like they can drive 80, 90 miles an hour with impunity. But what we have created in Pennsylvania, and actually based this on the state of Maryland's program from several years ago, is a automated speed enforcement program. So when you come upon a work zone that has a lot of signs that say automated speed enforcement in progress, any car that's going more than 11 miles an hour over the speed limit is going to get a ticket automatically through a camera operation. We are finding that is having an impact on driving, on getting people to slow down in work zones. That's the whole key. Revenue is not the point of this program. The point of this program is to get people to slow down. And one of the things that we point out, people say, well, you're worried about highway workers. Yeah, I am, and I think it's important that people get to come home at night after, or in the morning, as many cases are, after working. But the most of the injuries and crashes are to motorists themselves, so it's a safety to the motoring public as well.
Mm-hmm. And how is it working with summer coming now, and we're going to see the cones? Are you happy with this? Because in the past we've always talked about the fact, without the federal infrastructure bill, that we had the money to match, but do we have the money to match and to draw down the dollars that we need?
Actually, the federal infrastructure bill will provide a significant increase in monies to Pennsylvania, not just formula funds, but opportunities for grants and competitive funds as well. We will need to come up with about $1 billion in additional revenue over the next 2 to 3 years in order to make sure that we can fully match those federal funds. So I would say the next governor is going to have to negotiate or take the lead on something new. We could go back to our old saw, which is the state police, the money that's coming out of the highway fund now that people are paying in gas taxes. Back to that old gas tax argument. You could just simply fund it and fund the general fund with general funds and leave the road user monies alone, and you could do it that way. That's a very simple way to do it. I know that a year ago the governor had a Transportation Revenue Options Commission. They've made some suggestions on some things to look at as well. Eventually,
it'd be like miles driven, so that everybody else
some
that wants
states are starting to
have electric cars, they would pay their fair share.
Right, and there has been some discussion about looking at some of the gross receipts tax from utility gross receipts tax and moving that into the motor license fund as a recognition that people are plugging their cars in, their electric cars in at home.
Okay, well, thank you again, Bob. Again, we've run out of time before we run out of content. So we want to have you back again soon and keep us up to date on what's happening with the state's transportation system.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you for coming.
Good being with you.
And thank you, Jere, for sitting in for Maura this week. We'll see you next week again on Behind the Headlines. Tune in then.